The night the drums stopped, the ocean fell silent. Waves that once carried bodies and hope now whispered only loss. In the dying glow of torches, a crumbling statue of a king, once a slave, leaned toward the sea, its crown cracked in two. The air stank of smoke and salt, and somewhere in the ruins a hymn still echoed. We were free. But freedom, it seemed, had an expiration date. This is the story of men and women who tore their chains apart, carved a kingdom from jungle and ash, and built a world the empires swore would never exist. For a moment they ruled. For a heartbeat they believed. Then came betrayal. Then came blood. This is how the free slaves built a kingdom. And how the world made sure they lost everything. The sea was cruel that night. It tossed the ships like toys, snapping masts, swallowing prayers. But when dawn finally bled over the horizon, they saw it. A stretch of untouched coast, glowing gold beneath the mist. For the first time in their lives, they had reached land not as property but as people. They called it the Promised Shore. Men and women stumbled from the boats, kissing the wet sand, weeping into the earth as though it could hear them. The air was heavy with salt and rot, the ghosts of the Atlantic still clinging to their clothes. Behind them, the ocean hissed like an angry god. Ahead the jungle waited, vast and unknowable. Among them walked Amaury Delon, a man once broken by chains, now chosen by hope. He carried no crown, only a rusted saber, and a promise whispered to every soul who followed him: we will never kneel again. They built fires that night, dozens of them, small flickers of defiance against the dark. Children laughed for the first time. Old men sang songs their owners had once forbidden. But freedom, as Amaury knew, is never free. By morning, 3 settlers were missing. Their tents stood empty, the sand disturbed as if dragged back toward the sea. Some said they fled, others said the jungle took them. Amaury only stared into the mist, feeling something ancient watching from the trees. They began to build. Crude walls of timber, trenches, makeshift watchtowers. The settlement grew, a fragile heartbeat against the endless wilderness. Yet every hammer's strike echoed like thunder, every night's silence heavier than the last. One evening, as the fires dimmed, a sound rose from the forest, a slow rhythmic drumming. Not their music. Something older, something territorial. The women froze. The men clutched their weapons. Amaury stepped forward, hand on his saber, voice steady but cold. Freedom, he said, doesn't mean safety. Remember that. The drumming stopped. The jungle fell silent again. But the fear lingered, sharp, invisible, patient. By dawn, another sentry was gone. His rifle lay in the mud, his footprints leading into the trees, and never returning. Amaury stared into that green abyss and whispered to himself, the sea gave us freedom. The land may take it back. The kingdom of the freed had begun, and already something was waiting to claim it. The years that followed were a blur of sweat, fire, and faith. Against all odds, the settlement survived. The jungle was tamed, the soil gave harvest, and the people, once broken, began to believe they had truly escaped the empire's shadow. They called their city Nouvelle Aube, New Dawn. At its heart stood a wooden palace built from wrecked ships and plundered colonial ruins. Amaury Delon, once a slave, was crowned king, not because he demanded it, but because the people needed someone to believe in. He accepted, though the crown was a circle of rusted iron, forged from shackles taken from the dead. For a time there was peace. Markets filled with laughter. Drums returned to song, and the air smelled of roasted maize and salt. The freed people began to dream, perhaps for the first time. But paradise, even a fragile one, carries its own poison. The wealthy traders grew fat on sugar and iron. Soldiers began demanding payment in gold. And in the fields whispers spread, whispers that some of the new servants were not free. Captured wanderers, outsiders, prisoners of war. They were forced to labor, their wrists bound by rope instead of steel. It was a small difference, but it was enough to damn them. One night, a storm came roaring from the ocean, the kind that sounds like the sky itself breaking open. Lightning struck the graveyard hill, and when dawn came, the earth had split wide. The bones of the first settlers, the ones who died for freedom, lay uncovered in the mud. The people took it as a sign. The dead, they said, were restless. Freedom could not be built on suffering. Amaury walked among the graves in silence, his crown soaked with rain. We built a kingdom, he whispered, but perhaps we forgot why. In the palace, His wife Ilara found him staring at his reflection in a bowl of water. "You freed them," she said. "Now free yourself." But Amori didn't answer. Outside, thunder rolled again, not from the sea this time, but from the jungle. The drums were back. And for the first time, Amori felt the weight of something greater than fear. The creeping realization that freedom, once corrupted, begins to smell a lot like empire. The kingdom of ash and gold had begun to glitter and rot. The crown that once symbolized freedom now sat like a curse upon Amori's head. Each sunrise brought more unrest, more questions whispered behind closed doors. The drums from the jungle had gone silent, but the fear they birthed lingered in every heart. Amori's council, men who once fought beside him, began to plot behind his back. They spoke of trade deals, armies and alliances, of the need for discipline, of the dangers of chaos. Amori called it treason. They called it order. Each week more people vanished. Some were dragged from their beds in the night, others simply disappeared while working the fields. The royal guard said nothing. The people said nothing. Fear had returned, a different master wearing a familiar face. Amori's oldest friend, Benoit, tried to intervene. One evening he confronted the king inside the candlelit throne hall. "You freed us from the whip," he said softly, "only to replace it with your fear." Amori's eyes burned. "Fear keeps us alive." "No," Benoit whispered, "it keeps us slaves." The words cut deeper than any blade. Amori struck him across the face, the echo cracking through the hall like thunder. Benoit did not return the next day, nor the next. His name was quietly erased from the records. That night, Amori dreamed of the ocean again. He saw faces beneath the waves, faces of the enslaved who'd drowned long ago. Their eyes opened in the dark water, staring, accusing. He woke drenched in sweat, gasping for air that no longer felt clean. Rumors spread that the spirits of the dead had turned against him. The priests demanded offerings, animal blood at first, then human. The line between faith and madness blurred. The jungle, once their enemy, began to feel closer than God. One morning, Amori's crown was found lying at the foot of his throne, smeared with black ash. And no one admitted to touching it. The king refused to wear it again. From that day forward, he ruled bareheaded, a man haunted not by what he'd lost, but by what he'd become. And when the torches flickered at night, guards swore they saw something moving in the shadows behind his throne. Tall, silent, shaped like a man, but with eyes burning like coals. Freedom had birthed a kingdom. The kingdom had birthed a tyrant. And something in the dark had come to collect its debt. The horizon was no longer empty. Ships appeared, black-sailed and purposeful, cutting through the mist like predators. Traders from Europe, men with powdered wigs and silver tongues, came bearing muskets, steel, and promises. They called it opportunity. The people of Nouvelle Aube called it temptation. Amori's children, young and ambitious, saw a chance to expand the kingdom, to trade freely to gain power. The council welcomed them with open arms. Treaties were signed, ink-staining wood and palm leaves alike, binding the kingdom to outsiders. Each stroke carried the faint scent of betrayal. The Europeans brought more than goods. They brought disease, whispers of empire, and captives labeled indentured laborers. At first, the people rationalized it. These men and women were outsiders, criminals, enemies. Their chains were lighter than those they had once borne. But the sight of chains, however thin, rekindled old nightmares. Children would awaken screaming, clutching their mothers. Elderly men would stare at the ocean, their eyes glassy with fear, remembering the hulls that carried them across the Atlantic, remembering the lash and the auction block. Amori, older now, watched helplessly from the balcony of his palace. Ships docked in the harbor, and every day more shackled bodies were marched past the gates, not to leave but to enter. His heart ached for the freedom he had fought so hard to achieve, for the kingdom he had dreamed of building. The people began to murmur. They questioned the treaties, the foreign masters, the new indentures. A few dared to protest, only to vanish into the night. Amori wept not for them, but for the land itself, which seemed to remember every injustice, every stolen life. One stormy evening, lightning struck the tallest tower, splintering it like the promises of liberty. From the rubble, the city's children cried, and the council convened in silence. The words spoken in that meeting were harsh, and the orders that followed harsher still. The kingdom's defenders were instructed to march against their own people if necessary. to protect commerce and treaties over freedom. Hamori walked among the gates at dawn, his hands trembling as he touched the chains that had been brought ashore. They were thin, rusted, but they carried weight. The same weight he had once cast aside. The king's voice was barely a whisper. "We were free. We are free. Yet the chains return." And in the harbor, the tide carried whispers from the past. From the forests, shadows shifted. Something had waited for this moment, the first link in a chain that would bind the kingdom again tighter than before. Freedom had come with a price, and the reckoning was only beginning. Amori's children inherited more than a kingdom. They inherited a curse. His eldest, Isabeau, dreamed of justice, of restoring the ideals their father had fought for. She wandered the burned fields and hollowed marketplaces, pleading with the council to abolish the new indentured labor system. But her words were met with scorn. Her own brother, Lucien, saw only opportunity. To him, power meant control, wealth, dominance, a kingdom shaped not by freedom but by fear. Their rivalry ignited like dry tinder. Isabeau formed secret alliances with former soldiers and field workers, teaching them the old ways of resistance. Lucien, meanwhile, fortified the palace and port, surrounding himself with guards who knew only obedience. Every night he would pace the balcony, imagining the drums of the jungle as a herald for conquest, not warning. The city itself seemed to respond to their conflict. Rivers that once carried fresh water now ran thick with mud. Crops withered, and the smell of smoke and decay settled over Nouvelle Aube like a permanent fog. The people whispered of spirits angered, ancestors restless in their graves, and a kingdom that had forgotten its soul. When famine struck, Isabeau's forces sought to distribute food fairly. Lucien's soldiers intercepted them. That day hundreds fell in the marketplace, men, women, children, cut down in a single horrifying instant. The air was filled with the stench of blood, of roasted grain and the cries of the dying. Shadows danced across the walls, illuminated by burning stalls and collapsing rooftops. Isabeau fled into the jungle under the cover of darkness, carrying only the hope that someday the kingdom could be reclaimed. From the trees she watched her brother's forces torch villages, reclaiming what he called order. Lucien declared himself emperor, announcing his reign with a proclamation painted in blood across the palace gates. The people once free bowed under the weight of tyranny. And somewhere deep in the night, the jungle's drums began again, slower, deeper, more deliberate, as if counting the heartbeats of those who had betrayed liberty. The kingdom that Amori had built with sweat, hope, and blood was now a stage for betrayal and ambition. And in the silence between drumbeats, Isabeau swore, "The crown may sit on Lucien's head, but one day freedom would return." But for now the children of the kingdom had turned against each other, and the land itself seemed to mourn what had been lost. Under Emperor Lucien, Nouvelle Aube became a fortress of fear. Walls rose higher, lined with sharpened stakes, and watchtowers bristled with rifles that gleamed in the sun like teeth. Streets once filled with laughter now echoed only with commands and marching boots. Lucien's paranoia was absolute. Every shadow could conceal a traitor, every whisper a conspiracy. The jungle, which had once been their ally and refuge, now pressed in like an accusing hand. Vines crawled across abandoned huts, coiling over rooftops and palisades. The very land seemed to reject the kingdom's existence, forcing the inhabitants into constant vigilance. Lucien responded with brutality. Any hint of rebellion was met with fire, sword, or rope. The people began to fear their own neighbors, each glance a potential betrayal. Meanwhile, Isabeau's rebels moved unseen through the highlands, striking at plantations, freeing captives, and burning supplies. They were ghosts in the eyes of the empire, terrifying in their silence, untraceable in the trees. Each strike was precise, deliberate, a reminder that the kingdom's spirit had not been extinguished. The civil war stretched on for 7 years. Every battle scarred the land, fields scorched, rivers running red with blood, villages emptied or razed. Soldiers fought their own people, and families were divided by walls, rivers, and ideology. In the palace, Lucien's nights were sleepless. He dreamt of drums echoing in the distance, the jungle whispering, voices calling the names of the dead, soldiers, rebels, innocents alike. In the final confrontation, Isabeau's forces surrounded the palace under cover of storm clouds and smoke. Lucien faced them from the battlements, crown crooked, face pale. When the fighting ended, his body was nowhere to be found. Only his bent and rusted crown lay at the foot of the tower, half buried in ash and debris. The jungle claimed the ruins quickly. Trees swallowed walls, roots pried apart stones, and rivers carried remnants of the empire into the ocean. The drums fell silent again, but this time the quiet was suffocating, final. Nouvelle Aube, once a symbol of freedom and ambition, had devoured itself. Its people scattered, hiding in forests, fleeing to foreign ports or perishing quietly in the shadows of their own kingdom. The land itself seemed to remember the cruelty, the betrayal, the fires and the blood. Freedom had been built, and the empire that had risen from it had destroyed everything. And somewhere in the ruins the jungle waited, patient, as though the story had only just begun. What remained of Nouvelle Aube was ash and silence. Smoke lingered like a memory in the air, curling through empty streets where children once ran barefoot. Houses had collapsed into themselves, roofs caved, doors splintered, and markets lay in ruin, their stalls still smelling faintly of charred grain. The jungle had begun its slow reclamation, vines threading through shattered windows, roots cracking stone foundations, as though the earth itself was swallowing the kingdom whole. Survivors moved like ghosts among the ruins, their eyes hollow, their hands carrying nothing but grief and old memories. Some whispered of seeing shadows along the battlements at dusk, soldiers from the past walking silently, guarding nothing. Others spoke of laughter echoing from empty courtyards, of wind carrying the cries of those who had perished in the famine, the fires, the civil war. European traders returned, this time not as guests but conquerors. They found no king to negotiate with, no armies to oppose them, only bones, ash, and the faint stench of old blood. In their journals they called it an experiment in liberty gone mad, dismissing the centuries of struggle that had birthed the kingdom as folly. Yet the jungle kept secrets. Deep within the overgrowth, a small band of former slaves, unbroken in spirit, still moved silently. They hid the banners of the old kingdom, buried treasures and the stories of Amori's rise and fall. They waited, patient and wary, for a day when the world might remember that freedom had once been won here, and that it might rise again. At night, the wind carried a strange cadence. Some swore it was the jungle itself beating a rhythm, drums echoing from a forgotten past. Others said it was the sea speaking, whispering of chains broken and chains reforged, of a kingdom built with blood and ambition, of a people who had dared to rise and dared to fall. Historians would later come to the ruins and describe them as haunted, cursed, or merely abandoned. But for those who had lived through it, the silence was more than emptiness. It was accusation. It was remembrance. The ashes of Nouvelle Aube told a story few were willing to hear. Freedom is never simple. Even when it is won, the forces of greed, ambition, and fear will always lurk nearby, waiting for their chance to reclaim it. And somewhere beneath the creeping vines and the thick soil, the heartbeat of the old kingdom persisted, subtle but relentless, a whisper to anyone willing to listen. That liberty, though lost, had not been entirely forgotten. Decades passed, and the ruins of Nouvelle Aube became a place of legend. Locals spoke of trees that grew unnaturally fast, their roots twisting around bones and stone alike. Archaeologists arrived, digging through the thick soil, unearthing fragments of a kingdom long dead. They expected gold, treasures, proof of empire. Instead, they found horror, rows of unmarked graves, charred remnants of homes, and stone altars stained with dark, unexplainable markings. The deeper they dug, the more the air seemed to thrum, as if the land itself remembered. Some claimed the bones were arranged purposefully, almost ritualistically. Others swore the wind carried whispers, chanting in a language that had not been spoken in 100 years. The ruins told a story of ambition, betrayal, and blood, but also of freedom wrested from the jaws of despair, if only briefly. Legends spread. At night, figures were seen moving between the trees, shadows dancing under the moonlight. Children screamed of ghostly drums echoing from the jungle, and fishermen along the coast claimed that on certain nights the water glowed faintly, reflecting the faces of the long-dead settlers. Missionaries and historians documented their findings, yet their reports never fully captured the dread that clung to the land. One missionary wrote in his journal, "They sought heaven and built hell. Every stone here reeks of ambition and sorrow, a testament to what freedom costs when the world will not allow it to exist." The stories of Amori, Isabeau, Lucien, and the countless unnamed souls who had fought for Nouvelle Aube began to merge with myth. Was the destruction of the kingdom the result of greed, vengeance, fate, or something darker? No one agreed. Some scholars dismissed the tales as exaggeration. Others warned that the very ground was cursed, that the kingdom's ambition had angered forces far older than men. The forest grew thicker, reclaiming what had once been theirs. Vines crawled over broken stone, rivers swallowed pathways, and the ocean's tide carried away fragments of memory. The new dawn that the settlers had imagined, a life free of chains and fear, never arrived. Instead, the land became a mausoleum of lost dreams, a reminder that even when humans claw their way toward liberty, the world often refuses to let them stand. And yet somewhere in the shadows the whispers persisted. The drums, faint and irregular, continued to beat in the distance. They were not of this world nor entirely of the past. They were a warning, a remembrance, and a call. Would you have had the courage to rebuild what had been destroyed, knowing the same fate might await? Generations later, descendants of Nouvelle Aub's freed slaves returned to the ruins, drawn by stories passed down like whispers in the wind. They came with hope, to rebuild, to honor, to reclaim a legacy of freedom. But the land itself remembered. It remembered the blood, the fire, the betrayal, and the chains. The soil seemed heavier, the air thicker, as if the earth carried the grief of every soul who had lived and died there. Strange illnesses began to strike the returning families. Crops failed inexplicably. Animals vanished. Locals told them the spirits were restless, that the kingdom's dead demanded acknowledgement, demanded that their story not be forgotten. Some laughed, dismissing it as superstition. Others felt it deep in their bones, a weight that refused to lift, a presence that could not be seen but could not be ignored. A historian, determined to uncover the truth, found a Maori's broken crown buried near the old coast. Its metal was blackened, twisted, etched with symbols that no scholar could decipher. He held it up to the fading sunlight and whispered, "Was freedom ever truly ours?" That night his home burned to the ground. No one survived. The crown vanished, swallowed by the jungle, leaving behind only ash and mystery. Despite the fear, the stories refused to die. In villages along the coast, elders told children of a kingdom that had risen from chains, that had shone like a beacon of hope, and that had fallen not because the people were weak, but because the world would not allow them to succeed. The descendants who survived spoke cautiously, teaching their children the old songs and the old ways, not as mere history, but as protection. Every drumbeat in the distance, every rustle in the trees was a reminder. The past is never truly buried. Memory has its own power, and sometimes it is more binding than chains. Even today, explorers and locals swear they can hear the drums at night, not just a rhythm but a heartbeat. The heartbeat of those who once dared to build a kingdom, of those who fell and of those who refused to be forgotten. History may call Nouvelle Aube a failure, but its ghosts tell a different story. They whisper that freedom, once tasted, can never truly be erased, that even in loss the memory of courage endures. Tell me in the comments, do you think the kingdom's fall was inevitable or was something darker at work? History called it a failed experiment, an ambitious colony of freed slaves, rising from chains to carve their own destiny, only to collapse beneath the weight of ambition, betrayal, and external oppression. But failure implies choice. The truth was more sinister. The world had never intended for them to survive. Every step toward freedom was met with suspicion, every success punished by invasion, exploitation, or betrayal. Amori's vision, noble and pure, became corrupted not entirely by human folly, but by the relentless pressures of empires unwilling to acknowledge equality. His children inherited both the dreams and the curses of the kingdom. Isabeau's rebellion, Lucien's tyranny, the civil wars, and the slow decay of Nouvelle Aube were not merely personal tragedies. They were reflections of a system designed to crush those who defied it. The ruins, still hidden beneath the jungle and the rising tides, tell the same story. Crumbling walls and shattered gates, charred homes, overgrown streets. These remnants are proof that ambition and courage alone cannot withstand a world determined to deny them their place. The soil is saturated with the memory of those who dared to rise, and each rainfall carries it outward, whispering to anyone willing to listen. Freedom, as Amori learned too late, is fragile. It requires not just courage but timing, allies, and a world willing to let it exist. Nouvelle Aube had all but the last, and yet that does not make it meaningless. The people who built it, who fought and died for it, showed what is possible, if only for a moment. They proved that chains can be broken, that empires can be challenged, and that the human spirit can rise from the darkest oppression. But the lesson is painful. Ambition unchecked can become tyranny, unity without vigilance can become vulnerability, and freedom without the world's acknowledgement can be as fleeting as the wind. The ashes of Nouvelle Aube are both a warning and a reminder that liberty, once achieved, must be protected, nurtured, and never taken for granted. The ruins lie in silence today, yet their story echoes through time, a haunting question to every soul who dares to dream. Would you have survived this? Could you have held on when the world itself seemed determined to strip it from your hands? The kingdom is gone, its people scattered. Yet in every whisper of wind through the overgrown streets, in every hidden relic buried in the soil, there is a message. Courage matters. Freedom matters, and history, cruel and indifferent, remembers. The story returns to the shore where it began, where waves lap against blackened stones, and the wind carries the faint scent of salt and smoke. Amid the creeping vines and broken foundations, the statue of King Amori leans against the sand, its crown cracked and worn, half buried by time. The inscription, worn nearly smooth, reads only one word: Liberté. Fishermen who pass at dusk swear that the statue's eyes sometimes glow faintly, reflecting the molten gold of the setting sun. Some claim it's a trick of the light. Others, who have lived and died by the sea for generations, insist it is something else. A reminder that the kingdom once existed, that freedom was achieved, however briefly. The ocean itself seems complicit in memory. On stormy nights, the waves carry faint rhythms, echoes of drums once beaten in celebration and warning. The voices of those who built Nouvelle Aube rise from beneath the surf, whispering tales of hope, blood, and betrayal. The water moves like a living ledger, keeping count of the dead, the lost, and the free. The descendants of Nouvelle Aube still speak of the kingdom in hushed tones. Some come to mourn, others to remember, and a few to search for remnants of glory that might survive in the sands or hidden in the jungle. Every visit carries the same lesson. The empire fell, but the story endures. History may erase names, topple statues, and scatter survivors, but the essence of courage and freedom refuses to die. The ruins are silent now, yet silence in this place is never empty. In the wind there is accusation. In the waves a warning. In the sand the weight of memory. Every stone and every tree remembers. Even the sea, the constant unfeeling ocean, seems to honor the fallen, carrying their names on the tide, whispering that liberty was born here, even if the world could not let it remain. Amori's dream may have been broken. Lucien's tyranny may have destroyed the kingdom. The jungle may have swallowed walls and streets, and time may have buried bones and stories alike. Yet the sea remembers, and as long as the tide continues to kiss the shore, the echoes of freedom persist, haunting the present with lessons carved in blood and courage. Kingdoms may fall, empires may rise, but the memory of those who dared to break their chains will endure, a warning, a testament, a story that refuses to be silenced. Tell me in the comments, do you believe this was fate or something darker? And imagine for a moment that this was your family. What would you have done?